Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out NewDealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. Hello, Honorable Profession listeners. This is Ryan Coonerty, your co-host. We are having a conversation today that, frankly, we hadn't planned for our podcast. We had gone through different scenarios, from a Kamala Harris victory to a contested election to even a narrow Donald Trump victory. We hadn't planned on, although it was a close popular vote, such a strong showing by a person who had been convicted of crimes, tried to overthrow the government, and shown to be unqualified on every level. This has caused a lot of soul searching in the Democratic Party and those of us who believe that politics is an honorable profession and our leaders have a higher responsibility. So today, Debbie and I are having a conversation about what questions need to be asked. We're trying not to rush to answers, but think about where the party needs to go, where our leaders need to go, how our New Deal leaders at the state and local level will have to be on the front lines of democracy and defend democracy itself, as well as vulnerable communities, and improve the lives of their constituents in a way that we can win in the future. So this is at the beginning of a conversation. Over the course of the coming months, we will be having a lot of guests on the podcast. We will be asking ourselves and them hard questions. And we'll be highlighting people who are figuring out ways to stand up and ensure that politics is honorable and that the service we provide is not only impactful, but politically resonant, so that we can not have to experience another night like this again. Thank you for listening, and please enjoy our show. Debbie Cox Bultan, CEO of the New Deal and co-host of the Honorable Profession podcast. We are gathered here today because we had an expectation. We planned a lot of different potential podcasts following the election. We planned on a Harris victory. We planned on a contested election. We planned on a narrow Trump election. And we were sort of lining up guests in order to do that. And we ended up with an overwhelming Trump victory. It's still only a couple percentage points. We're still a divided country, but a clear electoral victory. So I want to start by asking, sort of, as someone who's dedicated their life to politics, like, how are you feeling right now before we start getting into the nuts and bolts and questions and concerns?
Yeah, I think that's such a great frame, Ryan. We had all these scenarios planned, and this was the one we didn't plan for. So by way of answering your question, I'll say this. It was a close election. It was both a close election and it was not a close election, right? So, I mean, on one hand, I think we need to remember that, this was an election where, if you look across the whole world about, what's been happening with the parties that have been in power when COVID hit and what's happening with the economic changes, people are unhappy, people are frustrated, and they're taking it out on people, the parties in power across the globe. So on one hand, we have these headwinds, and if you look at it that way, and I mean, I still think, although lots of my fellow Americans may not have agreed with me, I think that, they had a pretty terrible candidate, actually, who, but with all that, it was still close. But at the same time, I think that the thing that we're talking about, that our colleagues in the Democratic Party are talking about this week, rightfully so, is on one hand, yes, 2 points, whatever it was. But on the other hand, 48 states, Trump did better from as a percentage of the margin than he did, than he had done, and then the Republicans did. So in 2020, so that is a huge red flashing sign for us. And so, that the Republicans, even with that candidate, did so much better. I feel like is a huge warning sign. And so I think, so how am I feeling? I'm feeling, it depends on the day, it depends on the hour, it depends on the minute almost, but I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling disappointed. I'm feeling frustrated, but I'm also feeling reflective, and I'm feeling, what kernel of resolve and resilience I know is in there is growing, day by day, of just saying, okay, look, this is something we've got to reflect on, we've got to learn from, and we've got to keep going forward, because we got into this business because we believe that government could make a difference, that people in leadership can make a difference, and I still believe that. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling the same way. I mean, I've eaten a lot of my emotions of my kids' Halloween candy. I've gone through different stages. I will say one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is you and I are both Californians, and so in many ways we'll be insulated from some of the worst actions that the president and the Congress will take, and that's a great blessing to us, and makes me sad to think about vulnerable communities where this is going to be a really painful experience, and set of policies, and mean-spirited, and all the things that we know. But on this podcast over the years, we have interviewed a lot of mayors, county commissioners, state legislators who are representing blue districts in very red states, and they wake up every day committed to getting up and fighting the good fight. They know that they will, may not in their lifetime have a governor who will pass their law. They watch the impacts of bad legislation on their communities. They have power stripped away from them and their ability to govern and make decisions in their cities and communities. But yet, they are in the fight. They find it worth their time. They enter, and they make a difference where they can. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, of all of our New Deal leaders who frankly live this in a much more profound way, year after year, decade after decade. And so I'm trying to find their strength.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic point. That's absolutely right. And I mean, the other thing that I'm feeling, we're sitting here, the U.S. House has still not been decided, 48-ish hours after the election, and we'll see what happens. But regardless of that, we know we've lost the White House and the U.S. Senate. And, the people that we're talking to on this podcast, people that I work with every day at New Deal, are the state and local leaders around the country. And so, what happens in these state legislatures, what happens in these cities, how the federal policy is enacted, or what can be done at the state and local level to try to continue to push for solutions and for issues that we know matter to people is going to matter even more than it did, frankly. So, I think back to the first Trump administration, when we were working with state and local leaders, and, for just to take one example, right, when Trump came in and pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which, really, is such a terrible thing, and had so many Americans, feeling lack of hope around whether we're going to take climate seriously. Mayors and states stepped up to do their own climate action plans, to do their own work on this issue. And so I just, we'll see how this all plays out. And we'll have to be responsive to what this administration does. But in any way you slice it, state and local leaders are going to matter a whole heck of a lot over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I'm reminded that we started this podcast in 2018 in the middle of the Trump administration, darkest days, because I would go to a New Deal conference. I would hear about amazing work being done, and then I'd come back to meet my constituents, and I'd hear all hope is lost and everything's bad. And I wanted to translate some of those conversations and some of that good work to a broader audience, and I think we've done that over the years. And it's a good reminder that, government is not centralized in Washington, D.C. We live in a very diverse, dispersed governing system. And so state and local leaders will continue to play a huge role in both protecting their communities from maybe some of the worst impacts, but also in finding opportunities that they can take advantage of that become models for other local governments, and we can have a broader impact. I want to get to eventually New Deal leaders and how they did in this election, and there are some very bright spots that we should recognize, but I also don't want to lose the thread that this was a very tough election. The vice president, I think, ran a great campaign. She had lots of money. This is probably the best field campaign for a president that has ever been run. So it wasn't for lack of resources. It wasn't for a lack of organization. But we ended up with a bad result. And a lot of people are talking about the Democratic brand and why it's not resonating. And I don't think we have any answers today. But I think we should start asking good questions. And so what are the questions that you are thinking about when you think about that dynamic of good candidates, good resources, good campaign, extraordinarily bad damaged candidate on the other side, and not getting an outcome we want?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I mean, I have so many questions, but I kind of feel like, we've got to start with, clearly, to your point, the Democratic Party brand is broken, right? And that we are selling something people are not buying anymore. You talked about the start of the podcast. I will hearken back to my days where I spent almost 15 years at the Democratic Leadership Council before starting New Deal, co-founding New Deal. And, that effort was born in the 1980s after Walter Mondale lost 49 of 50 states, and they had to come together and say, what happened? Why are Democrats not doing well? What are the messages or the ideas that we're, pushing that are just not resonating with the American people? And so I think we're going to find ourselves in a little bit of that area. I mean, clearly, this isn't the time for answers, but I will say that, clearly one of the things that probably the top thing that I think was on people's minds was the economy. And not just I've heard that a lot, like the economy, but the economy is doing really well. We've got the best economy in the country, or in the world. I mean, after the COVID job growth has been great. The stock market's doing great. Inflation is down. But the problem with all of that, and all of that is true, and I do think the Biden-Harris administration did an amazing job of investing in America and righting the ship. But prices are up, and that's what people know, and that's what people feel every day. And so, I think that the vice president did a great job of recognizing that, talking about it, having some proposals to deal with it. But she also was part of the administration during which this is true. And that, again, there's lots of reasons for it that, but I think that that's something that we're going to have to ask the question is, what kind of economic strategy or, messaging, what kind of economic policies are we going to need to have going forward that is going to resonate with the American people? I actually think that this has been true in my entire 30 years of politics. The Democratic Party has had a brand problem when it comes to the economy. And the crazy thing is actually, like, our friend Simon Rosenberg over at Hopium has this amazing presentation on With Democrats Things Are Better, presentation on really how the economy has actually done very well under Democratic presidents for 50 years. And that's not been the case under Republican presidents. And we're going to see what happens here with a 20% tariff and tax cuts for the wealthy and everything else that Trump is proposing and what that actually does to our economy. But for some reason, the American people just do not buy it, that the Democrats are better on the economy. And so that's something I'm going to be watching. Obviously, there were segments of the population, of the voting population, that have traditionally been stronger Democratic constituencies than turned out to be true this time. So in particular, Latino voters, obviously lots been said about the shift there, about young voters, in particular young men of color. I think all of that is going to be something that we need to think about and talk about what's not, again, resonating with those voters. I am particularly interested or kind of surprised and curious about, that we did so much poorly in city centers than we have in the past. I've got my own ideas about that, but I think that that's something we've long not taken for granted. I think we've worked very hard at bringing people out, but I mean I think that that's something we got to take seriously and understand why that happened. I will add, as you noted, we're sitting here in California where the streak on the West Coast has continued of more liberal leaning DAs being voted out of office in big cities. And that was true. And this was true this time in Los Angeles. It happened in San Francisco. It's happened in Portland. I think that there's a correlation. I mean, that some of what's happening that we're seeing out here in very blue places where people are saying, look, the crime, whether or not, and again, this isn't a whether or not it's true issue, right? Crime is down, actually murders are down, but people are not feeling it. People don't want that kind of policy in their cities. So I think that's something we're going to have to grapple with. And maybe lastly, and I'd like your thoughts too, I would also say, I'm really interested. I have a lot to say, but apparently I'm really interested in one of the reasons I think a lot of us had hope. There were a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that we had hope that this was going our way, that felt like the momentum was shifting, but the democracy seemed to be resonating as an issue, and that in fact I remember the very first thing I saw in the CNN exit poll before results came back in was that across the country, democracy was one of the top issues people cared about. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking democracy. What I mean is January 6th and what Trump has done to be, an anathema to our institutions and to our democracy. And so, of course, but that's not how it played out. And I was looking today at some of the ballot measures and just being reminded that I think in 6 states, we've talked a lot about the abortion measures that were on ballots across the country and how that might turn out Democrats that would then vote for Harris. In 6 states, including Nevada and North Carolina, the initiatives were on the ballot to make sure that only citizens could vote, even though that is actually the law of the land. That is actually the law of the United States. But in 6 states, there were initiatives that said, yes, come out and say, yes, only citizens can vote in this election. And so for some people, democracy may have meant something entirely different than what I talk about when I mean that. And so I think that's going to be an interesting question too, is will democracy matter? Do people care about it? I believe they do, but how could we have this outcome after January 6th? Let's just to put the question really bluntly, right?
I think it's a great question, and we're about to see unprecedented levels of corruption and breaking down of norms and laws, and it'll be interesting to see if it matters, and how that plays out. I guess my follow-up question, and then I have some thoughts about the questions I've been thinking about, which is, I think immediately coming out, you're now, especially online, you're seeing, the Democratic Party needed to be more left. They need to be more center. They need to abandon these issues. They need to, and it's people are going to where their political interests and values may already be, and reading a lesson of this through that lens. And I guess it feels more structural to me. It feels more problematic. The Democratic Party brand feels it's more in peril than any one simple answer could be. And so how do you think the party has those conversations so that they aren't conversations where we all know the answer and we're going to find the evidence, where we're coming in with an open mind and hearing and trying to figure out what that is?
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good question. And to be perfectly candid, you won't be surprised that my answers. I don't think the answers that we went to, that we didn't go left, we didn't go
Yeah.
far enough left by any stretch. But if I think to your question, um, I think we're going to need to do a lot of listening, right? And I think we're going to need to, um, really be open-hearted and open-minded about what we hear, and take it to heart. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that I think that part of what happened here today is that both parties are seen as extreme, and that essentially, if those are my choices, I'm going to go with the person maybe who whatever who I think is going to be better for the economy, or whatever the answer was, right? But I do think that we've got to combat that. But I want to say one other thing too about this, because one of the other things I'm hearing a lot is, and I understand it. I really understand this. I mean, I had similar thoughts float through, which is like, something about the character of the person who's running, and frankly, the flat out racism and misogyny and anti-immigrant and all of those things that we know, people who watched him closely and were very tuned in particular to the last days of the campaign, the Madison Square Garden rally, you know, basically are saying, like, what kind of country could this be that 50+% of our fellow Americans could vote for this person in any way, shape, or form. And I think the thing that I do want to say is, I want to caution us about lumping every single person who voted for Trump in that bucket, because I just don't believe that to be true. I do not believe that half of our country is. I believe there are some. There's no doubt about it, and it might be, and we heard from some of them at some of the rallies. But I think that some people were not tuned in, were not, following this day to day, or at, maybe which is not great. At best case said, I'm going to vote for him despite that, not because of that, right? And so I just think that that's part of the listening part. Is, I don't think we should basically. It's not smart. I don't think it's smart as a human. I certainly don't think it's smart politically to start this new conversation saying, well, we're just going to write off 50% of the
Yeah.
of the electorate because they're racist and misogynist, and we're never going to get them, right? So I think that's one place we need to start when we think about how to go forward.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, the reality is, in 2028, well, and in 2026 midterms, we're going to need millions of people who voted for Donald Trump to come back around and vote for whoever the candidates we put forward are. And if you start by writing them off, that is a recipe to never win another national election again. And so
Yeah.
it's a very big deal. I thought it'd be interesting. One of the subsets you talk about was young men. And so I came to this podcast straight from my class. I teach a class at UC Santa Cruz. It's a senior capstone class. There are 23 women and 3 men in the class. And I was asking about this phenomenon around young men. And for those who are looking to read and think more about it, Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institution has been a leading thinker in this. And the reality is, young men, both in the United States, but also around the world, are catastrophically failing in education, in employment, in health, in drug use, in social isolation, and then turning to extremism and following, especially some of these incredibly dangerous online influencers, Andrew Tate, Ben Shapiro, and beyond. And he argues it's a society-wide crisis to have a group of people fail so dramatically. And he has a bunch of policy ideas. But it was fascinating because as I went around the class and I was asking them about their brothers and cousins, they story after story, young Latinos voting for Donald Trump in California, seeing him as aligned with their interests, seeing the Democratic Party as not a party of men. And it was striking over and over and over again, ignoring their sisters or their cousins' plea to protect reproductive rights and women's health and equal access, and being absolutely locked in. And so it was just so startling because it was not the exception. It was the majority where people they knew people who were turning out, who were both struggling in life, hadn't found a job, what hadn't weren't in higher education, weren't in job training, living at home, playing hours of video games, getting high, but they saw Donald Trump as their candidate, and Democrats as a threat. And so I think it's going to be a really hard conversation to have, but I think it's worth thinking about what we've done. What are we going to do to first help them as a population, and then second, how do you connect with them politically when they're being influenced by much bigger forces than any one political candidate can address?
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, don't you feel like, I feel like, here's the trick, right? Or here's the conundrum, but is a better word, right? Is, the Democratic Party is about inclusion and about all people. And it's, and for too long there have been, a lot of people who have been underserved or not given a seat at the table. And, we've seen, New Deal has a lot of like firsts of, first leader, first Black speaker of Pennsylvania, right? Woman, first, first this, first that all over the country, which is super wonderful and exciting. But at the same time, when we talk about it somehow, what people are hearing is that it's a zero-sum game. So if those gains are happening, and whether that's in political power, I think, or whether that's in the economy or whatever it is, if we're talking about, expanding the table, making sure everyone has a shot, somehow what people, and particularly potentially young men, are hearing is that must mean that I don't have it. It's not this idea of growing the pie. It's that if someone's getting it, I'm not. And JD Vance is such a master at using that language and Trump too, to stoke that. But like, how do we stay true to our value, which is to make sure everybody has a shot, but also not let any group feel like they're being left behind, if that's not what the intention is, right?
Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, I think it's a cultural, social connection that in many ways is just as important. But the amazing thing is, like, and Richard Reeves talks about this, is the Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS Act are probably the two biggest investments in largely male-dominated industries, construction, infrastructure. Made by any administration in history, probably since the New Deal, and yet the Democratic Party, and not also coming in and saving the auto industry in Michigan and Ohio, but the Democratic Party not only does not get credit for creating and investing in those jobs and those and young men, but also has resentment directed towards it. And I think that should be sobering, in that the investments and policies that you think sort of show that you're interested, care, want to help a community and a group of people make a living in a life. If those aren't resonating after $1 trillion investment, that's a big challenge.
Yeah,
And I think
that's
it comes
right.
down to the social, cultural piece that you're talking about.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And another question that raises for me is, and is it because people didn't know about it? Or is it because people know about it and don't think it's working? Is it because people don't care? I mean, and part of that to me also begs just a flat out question about kind of how we get information these days, and how politics is filtered through that information, and social media in particular. And lots is going to be talked about how, the different campaigns communicated with people, what worked, what didn't, but I think the whole media landscape, social media included in particular, maybe, I mean, it's a whole new world out there. And I think that that's going to be a huge question going forward, is like, how do you have these kind of dialogues, particularly people who want to have constructive, fact-based, problem solving oriented, not just grievance after grievance, because that's easier. Actually, the harder part is to have the conversation about how you build things, not how you tear it down. And so how do you have those conversations about building things in this media environment? It's a really big question, I think, going forward.
I think it is. I think one of the places where that conversation may happen is with New Deal leaders. Hopefully, New Deal leaders being listened to by the national folks, but also within their communities. Coming out of this, what do you see as the role for New Deal as an organization, and who are the New Deal leaders in this election cycle who swim against that tide, and what can we learn from them?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I mean, so yeah, it's very easy to focus on what went wrong and, and what we do about it. But we had a really New Deal leaders had a really good night in a lot of places. So we were super excited that two New Deal leaders were elected governor this time around. So Josh Stein in North Carolina and Matt Meyer in Delaware. I think in particular the North Carolina experience is going to be so interesting because not only did Governor-elect Stein win, pretty handedly, and actually Democrats, including Jeff Jackson, who's a friend of New Deal, won for Attorney General. So Democrats kind of won. Of course, Governor-elect Stein was running against Mark Robinson, who was a particularly flawed candidate, but there's arguments to be made that, so was the top of the ticket.
Yeah.
So how did that happen yet, but that our candidate didn't win for president. So I think that's interesting, but very excited to have those wins. A very good New Deal friend who's made a couple of podcast appearances. So our listeners will know Tobias Reed became Secretary of State of Oregon this week. And we had leaders up and down win for mayor, for state legislature. And then as we think about nationally, Angela Alsobrooks in Maryland, U.S. Senator. We're waiting for the final call for Ruben Gallego in Arizona. So New Deal could have a couple U.S. Senator alum. And still waiting on a number of House races, but we'll have at least a number of New Dealers in the U.S. House, including Sarah McBride, the first trans member of the U.S. House. Super exciting in Delaware, wonderful state legislator, and Kristen McDonald-Rivet, who picked up a very important swing seat in Michigan. So we have lots of bright spots. So, but to the question about what this means, I mean, I go back to kind of where I started about the importance of state and local leaders in all of this. And also the importance of continuing to build this pipeline as we're talking about these people winning for governor, winning for congressional seats. New Deal, I think, does two things really well. And this is what we will continue to work on. One is to find and to work with the most exceptional state and local leaders around the country who are doing really important things where they live now. And they will be continuing to do that. I think they will be the front lines of defense on many things here with the administration. I think that they will, be asked to carry a very heavy burden in this over these next 4 years. And so we're going to do everything we can to support them with good ideas, with a network, with just a rock and a home from which to govern, and to uplift them and to them and their voices. So you'll be hearing from lots of those folks going forward on the podcast. And then also I think that we do see these New Deal leaders rising in public service. So as we think about, the question will become who's, where do we go from here? Who's next? Who's going to be the standard bearer of our party? People like some of those governors, including Josh Shapiro, who I didn't mention earlier, since he's already been in office, and people to judge who's a New Deal leader. Those names are going to be among them. And there's many, many more that some of our listeners may not have even heard of yet, who I think will absolutely, undoubtedly be the future of our party and our country in terms of leadership.
I mean, yes, I'm not unbiased here, but if you're trying to figure out how to rebuild, in any business or any effort, you start with what's working. And the New Deal is an organization that is working so well and having such a profound impact on finding and supporting talent, on sharing good ideas that positively impact communities, and finding people who are able to swim against very difficult political currents and succeed. And so I hope a lot of the ears and decision makers are turning to New Deal to try to figure it out. And for our listeners, we are committed over the coming months to some of these hard conversations that we will have on this podcast, and some of the people who are on the front lines of our democracy and hearing what they're doing and the challenges they're facing and the real and tangible improvements they're bringing to their community. And so this is, we are not going to have all the answers today, but we think over the next 6 months, the next 12 months, we hope this podcast serves as a really important platform to hash some of these big questions out and then come out and be ready for the 2026 midterms with gusto.
Yeah. And can I just add that thank you for saying that, Ryan. I appreciate those kind words. And I of course, wholeheartedly agree. I will note that, one of the first things out of the block for us will be a post-election kind of report on what happened, interviewing New Deal leaders around the country in various places. And so, we're going to be, to your point, I think that those folks who are being successful across the country are a great place to learn. And I hope that we can bring that to the national debate, because I think this will not be solved from Washington. This is going to be solved from listening to the people on the ground who are actually being successful, both governing and in politics.
Amen to that. All right, Debbie, I'm looking forward to, if I'm going to have hard conversations, I'm glad it's with you.
I feel the same way.
And please stay tuned for future Honorable Profession podcasts, where we'll go in depth and try to see what can come out and how we come out stronger, even in the most difficult of times. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.